Today we're going to look at design, and before we do, let's just think what would make a bad design, perhaps something that is useless or doesn't work particularly well. So then, is a good design something that works well? Well, if we look at this table in the picture, it's functional, it works really well. But you would look at that and think it's a bad design because it doesn't look very nice. So to design something that looks nice and is functional is quite difficult because you have to think creatively, and that's what we're going to look at today. And in order to do that, we need a source of inspiration. We could go online and just get some images off Google, but that shows a lack of effort. So what I'm going to do is show you how to find inspiration locally, perhaps around the house, maybe in the garden. You could even go around your village. And by designing something that has inspiration from its surroundings, a design sits better in those surroundings. Let's go and have a look. Most of what you see around here I've designed and built myself. The house and also the shed. Had to build this to put the boiler in, which keeps us warm at winter. But I didn't want just a square rectangular shed because it wouldn't look very nice. So what I went for was a honeycomb shape instead. The barn. I built this to hold the lawnmower and all that junk that one day might be useful. But as it's going to be seen from the house at the bottom of the garden, it needed to fit within its surroundings because it's sat between the trees. So in order to help it look in place, it's kind of inspired by what a tree might look like with a trunk, if you like, an upright, and then it branches out at the top using natural materials and natural forms. This part of the extension was designed because I didn't want it to look like a boxy add-on, so the triangle helps the new extension blend into the old house a bit smoother. And to get as much light into the extension as possible, I put in this skylight, and sometimes you can use shapes within shapes. The brick edges of the lawn, because this forms part of the landscape, it's the boundary between where the lawn ends and the flower borders begin, it needed to blend in, so it follows an organic curve just like you would find in nature, and that allows it to fit within the landscape. Now we've seen some of the things that I've designed and what's inspired them, we need to find some inspiration to do the design task for today. Elderflower. Like this because of the vertical lines that the flower structure gives. This willow is very structurally interesting with the branches, but also look at the colour, really zesty green. If we have a look at the previous A-level work here, there's some great examples of excellent work, and students have taken a source of inspiration to help them design their product. That's what I'm going to give you an example of now. I'm going to show you how I use my inspiration to design my piece of furniture, and then it's down to you guys to find a source of inspiration or several sources of inspiration and use those to influence your design. You don't have to copy exactly what you see, but you use the shapes and the forms as a starting point for the design process. Good presentation of your design page is really important. I'm going to start with my title. I just did a simple line with a ruler just as a guide so I could put the text on there, keep it neat. I used bubble writing. That's just my style, it's what I like. You might have a different style, that's fine. What I definitely don't want to see is just some scruffy biro title that will put a frown on my face. So make it nice. Do some practice work on a piece of scrap paper if you need to. Always put a border on your page. Just keep it simple, nothing special, nothing fancy. I've just gone with a double line. I intend to put some colour in that later. Then to start sketching out my design idea, always sketch lightly. Whatever it is you're drawing, whether it be the title or the border or your actual design, sketch lightly in case you make a mistake and you need to erase it later on, or if you sketch light enough you can just leave any errors or bits you don't like on the page and they kind of disappear later on when you go over it heavy, which is what I'm doing now. So I'm just pushing firmer with the pencil, darkening down those lines so the drawing now stands out on the page. Once that's complete, I'm just going to do a side view here just to help a third person understand the design. So it also gives it a bit of proportion and scale by putting this ergonomic person on here. It just gives you an understanding of how big the product will be. Now I'm going to stick down the images that inspired my design. That's quite important because any third person looking at your work wouldn't know what inspired it without these images, so please don't forget to stick those on. Maybe you don't have a printer at home, in which case leave space and next time you're in school we can print those out. Just going to put a simple border around the images just to make the presentation look a bit more neat rather than just having a random picture floating around. It just helps tie it into the page. Just going to throw a bit of shading on those borders. I was going to use colour, changed my mind, going to use just tone. Just putting a bit of colour on the borders there just to add interest, sort of balances out the page. The images I've printed make one side quite colourful, so colouring in a border just balances the layout of the page nicely. Just darkening down those lines now. If you don't darken down the lines they just become lost next to the colour. Darkening down the title as well because I was happy with that. Of course if you pushed firmly to begin with you wouldn't be able to erase anything you weren't happy with. Now I'm just annotating, just basic annotation on here explaining the design. That's really important. You understand your design in your head, you know what you've done, but anybody else looking at your work doesn't. An annotation helps them understand. Just explaining how it works and what inspired the various sections of the design. And it's done. That took me about 15 minutes to draw that page from start to finish. I didn't just go straight onto the final page. I planned out what I was going to do first and I did some rough sketches, just basic ideas which took maybe 10 seconds of drawing, very quick. You don't have to, but I always like to plan out my page layout, so I just roughed out where everything was going to go. I probably spent 5 to 10 minutes doing that, and then I was happy to proceed onto the final page. The Bauhaus design movement is probably one of the more famous and well-known design movements out of the many examples there are. It's quite revolutionary in the way it changed people's thinking about design on an international level. So rather than it just being a small movement, a small group of artisans or designers, it actually made it into the mainstream, where it became perhaps found in consumerism and everyday products. This is an extremely famous piece of design and architecture. It goes way back, it must be 70, 80 years old. However you had it built today, it would still look contemporary and up to date and modern. It was revolutionary at the time because you wouldn't have seen domestic architecture like this prior to this building. It's different in many ways. Look at the glass. That today is normal to have large panels of glass, but back then it wasn't seen. The technology wasn't there to make glass that large. Going back before World War II, you would have a lot of windows that were handmade, hand blown, and that's why windows were so small back then, as well as going back even further to the Victorian era. The windows in any building were subject to attacks by the government, and that's where the expression daylight robbery came from. So to have big windows like this was really unique to this style of architecture at the time. That's a nice example of how material technology, manufacturing technology has progressed and allowed a change in design. Look at how open the structure is with the large open expanses there. That's very difficult to achieve without the use of steel. And to use steel in domestic architecture wasn't commonplace. You might find it in some of the old high-rise buildings and industrial buildings, but you wouldn't find it in domestic or household architecture. So that allowed this open frame design, and even down to keeping the underneath of the house open. I'm not entirely sure how you would mow the lawn under there. Perhaps get on your hands and knees with a pair of scissors, but even so, it does look beautiful. And this terminology, less is more, is a great statement, and it kind of summarises everything you see in this image. This is another great example of how changes in technology and material science has allowed a significant change in design. The roof structure of this building wouldn't be possible without reinforced concrete, which is where they take steel bars or steel mesh or both in some instances, and then cast the concrete around it in place. So they would have made a wooden form around this building here, poured the concrete over the top of the reinforcing steel and let it set, then remove the framework to leave this cantilevering structure that hovers in the air, again creating this open, airy, light-filled space. This is an important slide because it gives you those key phrases that summarise the Bauhaus style and what it's all about. And this is the sort of thing you would need to have in the back of your mind going into the exam or doing your coursework. These are the terminologies that you need to include in your work and be able to expand upon and write about. So please do pause this slide and make sure you read through this content. It's important as part of your studies you have designers' names at your disposal. You might reference them in your coursework, you might reference them in an exam question or answer. So you might discuss how a particular designer changed people's thinking on what a piece of furniture could look like, and then go into detail explaining what it was exactly about that designer's work that made that change and how they approached design in a different way. Design movements aren't just linked to architecture. They also are a big part of furniture design and product design too. On the left hand side of this slide we can see two good examples of how furniture have been influenced by the design style. If we were to imagine what a piece of furniture might look like from World War II or before World War II, you're going to be stereotypical antique brown furniture made of a hard wood, very well made, very beautiful in their own right, but quite old-fashioned. And I think coming out of World War II, everybody wanted something different. The furniture, in some ways, kind of reflects what you see in the architecture as well, doesn't it? This open framework that allows light to fall through. It's representing new changes in technology in manufacturing. We've got this steel framework here that's been manipulated with the tubes bent into shapes that perhaps would be extremely difficult to do in mass production or batch production prior to industrialization and improvements in manufacturing. Now you're going to have a go at this exam question. It's worth 8 marks, which is quite a lot. So you're going to have to do a fair amount of writing to access those full marks. You need to raise points and arguments and discussions and then expand on them. And that's really important. Don't just make a statement and leave it at the statement. You must explain your thinking behind it. So if we were to look at this question here, it's a chair. If I were to say to you, before you'd seen this image, describe what a chair should look like, you would probably give a stereotypical answer of what a chair should look like. So how has this designer challenged those old-fashioned concepts of what a chair should be? What have they done differently here? Think about the way it looks, its structure, its form, the materials they've used, the colours, the surface finishes. All of these things are really important in your answer. Function versus form. Is it a comfortable item to sit on, or does it just look pretty, or does it do both? Give an explanation about why that might be. How has the designer experimented with new thinking and new materials? What's the difference between these materials and previously perhaps used materials? How has changes in manufacturing allowed this design to take place? So consider all those things, as well as those social changes as well. Also think about mass production and consumerism. During World War II, the country and the vast majority of people were forced into poverty due to the austerity of wartime England, and coming out of that era into a new way of life where people had money and secure jobs and wanted to spend their money on items to make their houses look nice. And that's where consumerism was pretty much born, which is, of course, allowed to happen due to the advances in mass production, where very large quantities of products could be made very quickly, and that repeatability as well of the products being the same each time. Whereas prior to that, of course, you would have handcrafted products made by a skilled artisan, whereas now machines can take over and make huge quantities of products in a fraction of the time a person could. How could you structure that into a point in your answer for your question?